Okay, I would say here we go. Welcome to our final installment of LINSTOR Days, the developers Q&A with our LINSTOR development team. And just to give you a little overview how we're going to run this meeting or webinar, basically we will first go through the questions that have already been sent in. And then later we will, of course, jump into the questions that you guys ask us. And there we have two choices, basically. You can either put them in the Q&A section on the bottom, or you have the possibility to use the setting raise a hand, which will allow us to filter you guys out and give you the possibility to turn on your mic, and then you can basically ask your question live. So this is for the overview. And now we basically start with the team introduction. Brian, do you want to take over?
Sure. So I'll go ahead and start with myself just because I'm talking. My name is Brian Hellman. I originally helped found the US division of Linbit in 2008. I've been here ever since. We'll go ahead and just go across the list here. Renee, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and maybe tell everyone what you do?
Sure, thanks. Hello, everyone. So I'm Renee. I'm working in the Austrian department. I'm here now in Linbit since nearly 3 years, and I started helping making LINSTOR what it is today. So working on basically on LINSTOR. And also doing most or all the work on the LINSTOR client, which is written in Python and the library. And also I'm maintaining the Open Nebula driver.
Okay, thank you. Gabor?
Sure, thank you. I'm Gabor Hanati. I'm also working in the Austria department. I'm at Linbit for more than 3 years. And I'm almost full-time on LINSTOR development. So yeah, that's me.
Okay, Moritz?
Thank you. So hi everybody, my name is Moritz. I'm also here in Vienna, Austria. And it's been around close to a year now that I've been here at Linbit, and I'm basically the main guy for all things Kubernetes and yeah, Kubernetes.
Seems to be an ongoing trend. All right, Joel?
Hi, I'm Joel, originally from the UK, but also in Austria now. And I have done some work on LINSTOR itself and some on the Kubernetes integration before Moritz took over, and also on Drbd on the lowest level as well. That's me.
Okay. Last but not least, Robert.
Yep, I hope you can hear me. I dropped in a little late. So my name is Robert Altner. It says so on the label on my photo or video that you can see here. I'm one of the LINSTOR core developers, and more or less started LINSTOR in 2016 when it all began. So I had the honor of writing the first line of code in LINSTOR. Nowadays, mostly work on Drbd currently, Drbd utils more or less, and some of the parts of that, and not as much as before on LINSTOR, but I'm still kind of involved. And I may not be available the whole session, but I'll try to. I hope I'll have the time and I'll be available and maybe answer a question or two whenever an interesting one comes up. So let's see.
Okay, thanks. So I guess, do we want to go ahead and start fielding questions then?
Yeah, like mentioned in the beginning, feel free when you want to talk live, just use the raise a hand setting. I think it is in the Gabo, do you know that where the setting was?
If I remember correctly, if you open the participants list at the very bottom, there should be a button raise hand.
Yeah, so that might be it. Of course, you can always put it in the Q&A section. And I would guess we would just start with the questions that already got sent in. And Brian, if you can just go through the list, please.
Let me go ahead and
I put it in the Zoom webinar chat for all attendees also to see.
Okay, let me pull up the chat then, because I don't have that up.
Yeah.
Hold on, Zoom's asking. Actually, don't see it in the chat.
Wait, let me repost this one. Sorry, there it goes. And I posted for here. There it is. Now everyone should have access. These are the questions sent in before.
Yeah, let me go ahead and pull these up then. Sorry for not having these up.
No worries.
It's asking me to join the event. It says I'm logged out.
Otherwise, I just do it. I start with the first question.
Yeah, if you've got it. There we go.
Yeah, I got it. And that was sent in on Monday, October 26. Can I create the Drbd resource for the dual primary mode with LINSTOR? Whoever wants to start answering.
Yeah, then let me start. Yes, you can. Basically, it's just a property on either resource definition or yeah, you could also set it on the controller level, but that makes not much sense because you should enable dual primary only in live migration settings for virtual machines. That is why it's there. And yeah, so it is just a property for that Drbd property, and it's called what's it called? Allow to allow dash to dash primaries, and yes, and then the resource will have this configuration in the Drbd config. And like we have it in the OpenNebula plugin, we only enable it for the live migration. So when the live migration starts, we'll set this property. It will update it on the satellites and then the Drbd resource. And when we finish the live migration, we unset it again. So we don't run into circumstances which could do a split brain or something like that. But it is possible.
Okay. Yeah,
so
please, Brian.
Oh yeah, so for the dual primary things, that's specifically for live migration. It's not necessarily to run permanently in dual primary. Is that correct?
Yes, only if you know what you're doing, and you can use it for example, cluster FS where this is needed. But you always need some layer above who does the logging for you, so that not two satellites or two nodes write on the same block device at the same time, because then you will probably have data corruption. And Drbd won't reject it.
I think I can chime in here a bit because there was another question asked, is there any downsides of using dual primary with Drbd 9? And in general, whenever you can avoid to run a dual primary, you should probably do that. So the difference between active-active and dual primary is if you have an active-active setup, you have different resources in the primary role on different nodes at the same time. So all your nodes are doing work, but they're not primary on the same resource. And the advantage of that is that you avoid lots of potential problems that you run into with dual primary mode. And the most important one is that if you lose the replication link in a dual primary resource, then you more or less run immediately into a split brain situation unless you have fencing configured, which most of the cloud deployments don't have fencing normally. So clusters often do and should. Dual primary, that is generally harder to configure, is harder to use. It is limited to only 2 nodes unless you're doing live migration. Live migration, you can have multiple nodes, so there can be multiple secondaries and 2 primaries for live migration, because that is a very special scenario that we have tested and we know it works. But if you're running a cluster file system on top of that, or something like an SAP HANA database that has multiple block devices on multiple nodes below it, then it is limited to only exactly 2 nodes, both of them being primary, with no additional secondaries, and also not 3 primaries or 4 primaries, because we cannot guarantee that the data stays consistent in those scenarios. So this is really limited to live migration. I think that's all about dual primary, the most important things about that.
Yeah, I think it's important to note too that, you know, a lot of people request dual primary for performance sake. Depending on your scenarios, it may not actually give you better performance. One thing to note that I think goes overlooked quite a bit is with Drbd, you can actually pull reads from the secondary nodes. So you can, you know, if the primary node is busy and it's quicker to pull the reads from a remote disk, Drbd can do that. The reads will still pipe through that primary node, but you're utilizing these secondaries disks at that point. And that's configurable within the Drbd config. And I believe there's block size settings, and then you can also set policies for when it does it. So it either balances it or it only balances it if the read requests are heavy on the primary node, etc.
It's on by default, by the way.
Okay, that's good to know. And I believe we have a blog post on that as well. And I think that I want to say we saw about 170% read performance. It definitely wasn't a 2-to-1 or 1-to-2, but it was close. Okay, we can go ahead and move on to the next question. I pulled the questions up, Neil, so I've got them. The next question is, if there are multiple nodes, such as 3 nodes, when I create disk-full Drbd resources on 2 nodes, will it automatically create a diskless resource on the other one? So I think that falls in line with the policies, perhaps.
Yeah, I can take the question, I guess. So by default, LINSTOR has this property activated that does exactly this. It's called something like auto typebreaker, if I'm not mistaken. And just this is the prime example, as you asked the question, whenever you have a spare node after creating 2 disk full nodes, the third one or one third one will get this diskless node, which will act as a so-called tiebreaker, because LINSTOR also automatically enables the Drbd's quorum feature, which is important in case you lose one of the nodes. So the other 2 nodes, they have quorum, they can continue working, but this needs to have at least 3 nodes, because 2 nodes can't decide who is right, who is wrong. And this third tiebreaker node can also be a diskless node, a diskless resource, sorry. And this is exactly what LINSTOR automatically configures for you.
So is that like virtual fencing then for if you're in a cloud infrastructure?
It should more or less replace fencing, actually.
Okay. On that note, we have somebody asked if we could use a Raspberry Pi as a tiebreaker. It's a good question, because that's one that I'd actually brought up myself several months ago. I don't think we've actually developed it yet, but the thought was there. I don't know if a developer wants to speak to that. I think there needs to be something compiled for the ARM architecture.
It's possible. It is platform independent, so anywhere you can run just the standard normal Linux kernel, and Raspberry Pi is one of those platforms. You can run Drbd, and you can also run LINSTOR if you have a Java virtual machine for it, which I believe there is. So as long as that is available, you can run LINSTOR and Drbd on it. And we have had people run Drbd on Raspberry Pi just for fun, just to try it out and replicate like micro SD cards and USB sticks with it. So it can definitely be done and can definitely be used with Drbd.
Yeah, also jump in our build servers already do ARM builds, so we can run on Raspberry Pi, and so the tiebreaker node can also run on the Raspberry.
Okay, so what you're saying is I need to test this out then. Okay, we'll go on to the next question. Oh, we had somebody pop into the live chat here. Does LINSTOR operator use Kubernetes fault zones to schedule volume replicas in separate zones?
So that's a good question. I'll take it, I guess, since I've said I'm the Kubernetes guy. So currently we can schedule on, or you can set up your volumes or your storage class in Kubernetes to schedule replicas on different zones. With one thing I have to add there, this is right now only true for LINSTOR's own concept of zones where you also can tag nodes with basically this is part of one zone and the other, and there is basically the link between the Kubernetes node information and the LINSTOR node information is missing, but that's a small thing that hopefully will be added into our Kubernetes offering soon. And then you can just say, what's it called? I think the option right now is called replicas on same and replicas on different. And then you can specify how many replicas in each zone should be scheduled, or how many, or over how many zones you want to replicate your volumes. Yeah.
Okay. Next question is, how does OpenStack plus LINSTOR cluster ensure high availability?
Yeah, I will try to answer that. I think there's no OpenStack guy from us online today, but basically all you need is you need to have the LINSTOR controller high available. So to do that, it's best to use some database like Postgres, where you can just connect to, configure the LINSTOR controller for it, and I guess OpenStack will have something like an high availability mode where you can start or you guarantee to start a virtual machine on some node which is reachable, and you can configure the client or to reach an IP or the plugin, and if the LINSTOR controller runs on that IP, it will always have the database from the Postgres or the data from the Postgres, and so it knows its state. And even if the controller is not running, it shouldn't be a problem, because the satellites will just continue to run and will not touch any configuration until they are connected to the controller again. And so I cannot give you the exact answer right now how to do it, but it should be possible, because we had a blog post, or we have a blog post for how to do it in Proxmox, and I think it's basically the same for all open cloud stuff. So you just need to make sure the controller is somehow highly available.
Okay, so you had mentioned that if the controller is lost you're still able to access the data. Is that true across all LINSTOR clusters then? Because there's a question about that, and if you might as well just answer it now.
You cannot access the data while the controller is down. I mean, not from the client side, because the controller is the central point of control. That's why it's called controller. And so, as long as the data base is online, because the controller uses some sort of SQL or etcd key value store, where it stores its data. For example, for vSAN, we use an etcd cluster to have it highly available, and we use Pacemaker to just make sure that the controller is started on one of the available nodes, and it always will connect to this etcd cluster. And as long as this is running, you can access the data.
Let me jump in here real quick, because I think when you mentioned something which might be a bit misinterpretable. René said that the data is not accessible when the controller is down, which is not quite true. If the controller is down, obviously the controller cannot answer new requests. So, which means if you query a new volume list to get the device path, for example, you will not get an answer because the controller is down. But the applications that already have the device path and are running and using Drbd still continue working. So if completely LINSTOR is down, not just the controller, but all satellites, they're already running applications keep running. That's just one point that I wanted to stress a bit.
Okay, yeah, I think that answers it. So another question we've got here, are there any special considerations for data volume replication, replicas equal 2, specifically with regards to split brain versus replicas equal 3? So I think we've answered this in the sense that we had mentioned that Drbd automatically attempts to do the quorum with the diskless node. So if you did 3 replicas of the data, in essence, you wouldn't necessarily need the diskless node, if I'm interpreting that correctly.
That's true. The so-called tiebreaker is just a third diskless node, but if you already have 3 disk full nodes, it has the same way the quorum, which you could achieve with the tiebreaker, but the third node has disk instead of being diskless. That's the only difference.
Okay. And here's a good question. Can we import existing Drbd pairs into LINSTOR?
Yes, that's possible. And quite some time ago, we had this Drbd manage utility, which was the predecessor of LINSTOR, as you could say. And we actually also written some migration scripts which exported all the configuration from this Drbd manage and imported it into LINSTOR. So we have a dedicated path for that. Without Drbd manage, so if you already have a handmade Drbd cluster configured and want to give it to LINSTOR, so to say, all you have to do is just do the LINSTOR resource create commands as you would do with a completely fresh cluster, and LINSTOR will simply detect that the LVs with the expected names are already there and the Drbd is already running, and it will just take over smoothly. So the only thing you have to make sure is that at the very bottom, the LV names, the logical volume names, are the same as LINSTOR expects them. If LINSTOR finds them, it will take them. That's it.
Sounds easy enough. Next question. In a Kubernetes environment, can you move replicated storage between clusters?
So to answer this question, the very, very short version is, how I understand it, is no, because for LINSTOR itself, LINSTOR only concerns itself with its own cluster. So if you're running LINSTOR on your Kubernetes cluster and you have a different Kubernetes cluster that's also running LINSTOR, but its own instance of a LINSTOR cluster, then there is no difference between basically trying to share the storage without LINSTOR. So there's not any additional help. What is possible is that the LINSTOR cluster itself doesn't necessarily have to be or doesn't necessarily have to consist of the same nodes as Kubernetes. So in theory, you could have one LINSTOR cluster that you can use to provide storage for multiple Kubernetes clusters, in which the nodes just attach to the one real LINSTOR cluster controller instance. So this would work, but again, this depends on what exactly your needs are and how strict you want to be with sharing information about available volumes and so on between clusters.
Okay. And that is, there's one more question. Is there any kind of reporting included in LINSTOR? For example, can I get a report of how much storage is allocated versus how much is actually being used? And the answer to that is yes. Gabor, do you want to elaborate on that?
Sure. So since almost the beginning, we have the simple command storage pool list, which basically gives you a list of storage pools. What else? And this, if you're using the LINSTOR client, you will get a tabular view of not just the storage pools, but also the total capacity of each storage pool. And I think it's the free space, which means that you can also calculate the used space. So you have all data. Maybe a side note interesting to mention here is that every LINSTOR command can also be added the -m or -- machine readable parameter, which means that you get the same information you're presented as a human readable table, for example, as a JSON code. Which means that if you want this storage pool list, for example, as a machine readable, pipe it through something like JQ, you can easily calculate anything you want.
Okay. Another question came in. Is LINSTOR managing the cluster with Pacemaker and CoroSync, or is it just using Drbd's auto promote feature? I believe unless you configure it to use Pacemaker, it just utilizes auto promote, but it's probably somebody else better suited to answer that.
I'm not quite sure what this question is about, but Pacemaker comes in if you want, for example, to have a controller that is highly available and you want to move the controller around. So you have only one controller started on a specific node, and there are other methods to do that. For example, starting the controller virtual machine on one node or on another node, depending on which one of them is still active. But apart from that, LINSTOR itself does not need Pacemaker. It also does not really need Drbd auto promote. That's what the applications normally do when they use the Drbd resources that are provided by LINSTOR. But the LINSTOR itself does not care whether the resource is in auto promote or not. And I know Drbd Manage used Drbd auto promote to distribute its own data, but LINSTOR just uses either a database or etcd, and it does not at all rely on Drbd. That was one idea, one basic idea in the design of LINSTOR, was to make it independent of Drbd, so that even if there's a problem with Drbd, LINSTOR would still be able to diagnose the problem, give you an error report, save something to its own data stores database in that case. So it does not really care whether the Drbd resources are in auto promote or not.
Okay, so you'd mentioned that LINSTOR can operate outside of Drbd. What other storage can LINSTOR consume, or what other options do you have outside of just using Drbd?
Well, for example, you could even use it without Drbd and just manage LVM or CFS with it. Some other layers like what do we have? Encryption, for example, is management for Linux encryption is built into LINSTOR. And I think we have a couple other layers. Gabor knows most about those because he wrote most of them. And so I'll just let him answer that question.
Yes, so at least some I can remember right now are additionally to Drbd and obviously the storage, the most bottom layer. Robert also mentioned the LUKS layer, the encryption layer. Additionally, we have cache as well as a white cache layer. And we also support NVMe, both sides, the target and initiator sides, which LINSTOR can also pair, obviously. And the newest layer, if I'm not mistaken, is the OpenFlex layer, which is also based acts as an NVMe client and NVMe initiator, but the target side is managed by the OpenFlex system by Western Digital. As far as I know, that's the layers LINSTOR currently supports. Many more could come.
And regarding the components that LINSTOR consists of, that's the controller and the satellite. Most of that concerns the satellite because the satellite is what uses storage and what needs all the storage infrastructure. So the controller is even more independent from anything below it than the satellite. You can run the controller on AIX or on Mac OS or on Windows if you want. Last time I tried, it still worked. I'm pretty sure it still does. With the satellite, you obviously need like LVM, CFS, things that are typically available on Linux. So if you start it up on Windows, it'll probably start, but it can't do anything useful right now because it does not support the storage layers that you have on Windows, but it will probably start. The controller should work just fine on most of those operating systems, at least all the Unix operating systems.
Okay. Somebody asked, can we create LINSTOR on a different OS? And I don't know that, I mean, you may have touched upon that right now, Robert. But I mean, if you wanted to elaborate a little bit on that, or also, I would assume that probably wouldn't be recommended, but you could probably do LINSTOR on like CentOS and Ubuntu and have them in the same cluster.
So design-wise, it would not be hard to port it to different operating systems. As long as you don't need Drbd, because then you would have to port Drbd as well, which is another story because that's a kernel module, so it's written for Linux. And by the way, it's also available on Windows now, so even that can be done. It was quite a piece of work, but that has been done. And yeah, as I said, with the controller, it would be easier than with the satellite because the satellite relies on lots of tools, user space tools that are called by the satellite that are available on Linux that are probably a bit different on, for example, FreeBSD or NetBSD, OpenBSD, whatever other operating systems you have there. If you have the same user space environment and you do not rely on any kernel specifics of Linux, it would probably run on those other operating systems too. And some of the infrastructure, similar infrastructures available on other operating systems. For example, you do have LVM on AIX. That's where it came from originally, but it's not compatible with Linux LVM. So that those are completely different implementations and the commands are completely different. So it would not work out of the box. You could write an LVM driver for LINSTOR and it would probably work pretty much the same as it does on Linux. So currently, in practice, I'd say that's a no. In practice, it will only run on Linux right now. But in theory, if you're willing to put work into it, if you have a community, if you want to port it design-wise, it would not be hard to do.
Yeah, anything's enough possible with enough money, right?
Right.
So you did mention that other operating system that nobody likes to speak of, Windows. And somebody had asked if what WinDRBD is, and is it running on Windows or something else? I mean, I can
Yeah,
answer that, or if you want to
runs on
elaborate, that's
Windows.
fine. Yeah, it
Exactly.
actually started out as an April Fool's joke. I think it was back in 2010, I believe. We had done a post, and we actually got some inquiries. We're like, no, it was a joke. It wasn't real, and now it's real. So it's no longer a joke. So yes, Drbd runs on Windows. We're currently in the RC of version 1. We need testers, so if anybody wants to do that and taint their network with a Windows system, we're more than happy to provide that for you. To test it. It's also open source. It's on GitHub or GitLab, if you want to check it out and download it. Another question: should we use VDO below or above LVM when using Drbd with it? And VDO is the deduplication software, I believe. It used to be by Permabit, but now I think Red Hat owns it.
Correctly, yes. I just had to look it up because I never can remember how we. But how we do it in LINSTOR, if you use the create physical device, we use video below LVM. So it's LVM on video.
Okay. Let's see. Go ahead and mark that one answered. Then if there's a 3-node cluster with Pacemaker, how do you ensure that the split brain problem will not occur? So I think that's going to largely depend on whether it's a virtualized environment or a physical hardware. I mean, if it's physical hardware, then you utilize fencing. But as was mentioned earlier in the call, Drbd now has a quorum feature, so you don't necessarily need those physical fencing measures as long as you have quorum among the Drbd nodes. I believe that's correct.
Yes, this should be in theory. This should be the right answer. Yeah. If you have 3 nodes and one of them is a tiebreaker, then you shouldn't need a pacemaker to avoid split brain.
Okay. Okay, somebody asked, I'm thinking to create HA for my application with 2 nodes. Can I add another node on another data center as disaster recovery in the same cluster?
Basically, yes, nothing stops you. LINSTOR does not really care if it manages one or multiple data centers as long as it's one LINSTOR cluster. What you can do is for disaster recovery, either use Drbd Proxy or to use the relatively new snapshot shipping feature from LINSTOR, which somehow aims to replace Drbd Proxy by incrementally shipping snapshots to the disaster recovery side. So you have more or less a backup on that side, and if the primary data center crashes or all nodes crashes, then you still have your backups.
Okay, so there was a follow-up question that can we implement LINSTOR between 2 different geographical locations through the internet, maybe via VPN? So I think the answer is yes. For Gabor had mentioned, and correct me if I'm wrong, but Gabor had mentioned Drbd Proxy. For those that may not know, Drbd Proxy allows you to use asynchronous replication. So you can replicate your data across long distances without negatively impacting the performance of your workload.
That's right, yes. So basically, with long distance replication, you have the issue that simply your network buffer gets full. And even if protocol A is activated with a full network buffer, the Drbd resource itself has to slow down. It cannot process more I/O. Drbd Proxy solves this problem by using your RAM as an additional network buffer, if you want to say that. So that's the purpose of Drbd Proxy. And regarding the question, if you can set up LINSTOR in 2 different geographical locations, yes, you can. All you have to make sure is that the servers can reach each other network-wise. So if you just do the LINSTOR node create command and the node shows up as online, everything should be fine.
Okay. Follow-up question on that one. Drbd Proxy, is that a must for the long distance? So I think for the long distance replication, I mean, if you want to elaborate, go ahead, because the developer.
Yeah, it always depends. If your network, even in long distance replication, is good enough, you possibly do not even need Drbd Proxy. If your network connection is not strong enough, you might want to use Drbd Proxy, but Drbd Proxy also replicates the data somewhat in real time. But as a complete alternative to Drbd Proxy is, as mentioned, the snapshot shipping, which periodically makes snapshots of your primary site of your primary data center and ships it incrementally to the disaster recovery site. So snapshot shipping can be or should be considered as an alternative to Drbd Proxy.
Okay. Yeah, one of the things that you run into when you're replicating over long distance is latency. And as Gabor mentioned, depending on your workload, I mean, if you're writing like Microsoft Word documents or something like that are really small, then you probably don't need proxy. But if you're trying to, write large data files such as videos or things like that, where the file size is going to surpass the bandwidth available, you will take a performance hit without something like proxy in place where you can buffer that communication over the network. Next question, the CSI provider creates PVs with names of the form PVC-UID. Is there an easier way to view LINSTOR resources for a given PVC without first having to do a kubectl get PVC to get the volume name and then find it in LINSTOR? Would you consider integrating PVC-friendly names when viewing LINSTOR resources?
So again, I would love to do that. The problem here is that the Kubernetes API itself doesn't provide us with the original PVC name. So this PVC-UID name is actually what we get from the Kubernetes API, and at no point do we get the information on which persistent volume claim or actually caused this request to get to the CSI driver. So unless something changes in the spec, there's currently no better way.
Let me jump in here a bit. It's completely true what Moritz said. Regarding other setups, so not CSI or not even Kubernetes setups, if you face the same problem that you need to name your resources for whatever reason quite complicatedly, but you want to have a user-friendly name for it, LINSTOR has this external name feature where you can specify for a resource name an external name which is not used internally but for the user. This is exactly for this purpose, but as Moritz explained here, Kubernetes does not support this.
Okay. It's good to know. I actually didn't know that we had user-friendly names. Well, it looks like we've answered all the questions in the world right now. So, guess we can wait a few more if there's anything else. Maybe while we wait for questions, you guys could talk about some upcoming things you're working on or anything new and exciting in the world of development at LinBit.
Just one, did we answer the one, what happens if the controller is lost?
I think we did go around that. I mean, I guess if you want to elaborate on, let's say it's permanently lost. I mean, then what?
Well, I mean, if you lost the controller database where all the information of the LINSTOR is stored, then yes, you have a bit of a problem. But if you just lose the controller node, for now nothing will change, because as long as you don't do new requests or like new resources, everything should run like it did before, because the satellite won't change anything. And if you didn't lose the controller database, you can just copy it to your new node or make access to your database from the new node with a freshly installed controller, and everything should work as before. So,
what are some means that you could take to prevent from losing a host controller? Like, I mean, I would assume that we could make it highly available with Drbd, or do some type of backup or something like that. Like,
well, you could use a replicated Postgres as Postgres database, or on some other node, and I think there are HA solutions for Postgres. Another thing is, yeah, you could do that H2 is our internal database, which is the default for LINSTOR, which is just a file on a disk. You could make that into a Drbd resource on a Drbd file system, but then you have a bit of an egg-chicken problem if you want to manage this with LINSTOR itself. So this makes it sometimes complicated. And another way would be to use an etcd cluster. This is also a possibility, because
and that would be something that you'd need to manually set up then?
Yes.
Okay.
For now, we have no automatic setup of an HA LINSTOR installation, except for the LINSTOR vSAN, which basically does this for you. It sets up a LINSTOR cluster for you for iSCSI exports.
In Kubernetes, it's more or less automatically HA.
Well, it doesn't look like we've got any other questions coming in. I think that's what we've got. Is there anything else you guys would like to share with everyone? Niels, I saw you pop back in.
Yeah, I guess just a final statement before we conclude the meeting. Just wanted to thank every participant, but also the attendees. And I have the feeling that you guys enjoyed it, and I think we're gonna like repeat this in one form or another. And of course, we will send out all the slides and the records to the attendees per email in the coming week. And and we like something like today, we actually do on a monthly basis. Like, we do a developers update podcast on YouTube. I posted the link for our YouTube channel in the chat, and there's a next episode tomorrow. And so if you enjoyed today, this is where you can basically get more content from us on news for LINSTOR and Drbd.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for your time, and I hope you guys over in Vienna have a good evening. And then I'll continue having my day over here in Portland.
Greetings from Portland.
All right, goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye, guys.
Have a good evening,
Bye.
everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.